again to another video by Aga. Hello, Abby. My name is Aga, and that's on the floor. It's my dog Abby. I will put some pictures over here. And today we'll be watching Why Doesn't Iceland Have an Army from TLDR News EU. Let's just start it. Let's go.
This video was brought to you by CuriosityStream.
Because everyone's curious about that.
What makes a country a country? Well, it's usually argued that there are 4 criteria. A government, a permanent population, the ability to interact with other states, and a defined territory. Historically, the last of these conditions could only be met if the territory could be defended. After all, territorial wars have been relatively commonplace, and the only way to defend your territory is with your own military. The question is this still a necessity in the 21st century? Expansionist territorial wars are not as common as they once were, and international organisations exist to defend innocent nations from aggressors. While there are a few countries that don't have militaries, these are generally micronations.
But they're kind of small, huh?
There is one exception though, Iceland. With a population of almost 400,000, they are by far the largest country to forego maintaining their own military. So let's have a look at Iceland, the largest country in the world that doesn't have its own military.
Huh, that's interesting.
To understand why Iceland doesn't have a military, we need to understand a bit of Icelandic history. Iceland as a nation hasn't actually existed in its current form for very long. At the start of the 20th century, Iceland was a part of Denmark, and as such was protected by their relatively impressive military. While historically Iceland had few powers of self-governance, the early 20th century saw Iceland slowly gain devolved powers. The most significant development in the right to self-governance happened in 1918, when Iceland became a sovereign country under the constitutional and hereditary monarchy of Denmark. In essence, Iceland was its own nation, but was binded to Denmark through their common monarch. Importantly for this video though, when hashing out the details of what the new relationship between Iceland and Denmark would look like, Iceland requested that Denmark would continue to represent its foreign affairs and would handle its defence interests on Iceland's behalf. It was made clear though that Iceland would still have powers over these 2 areas, and that Denmark would only take responsibility for them for as long as Iceland asked them to. This became significant just over 2 decades later, when the Second World War broke out. Iceland began by committing to a policy of neutrality, as it often did in its history, which became difficult to stick to in 1940 when the Nazis invaded Denmark and scuppered communication between Denmark and Iceland. As you can imagine, this made it near impossible for Denmark and Iceland to work together on defence and foreign affairs, and as such, Iceland passed 2 resolutions which invested the Icelandic parliament with the powers of the head of state. In essence, this gave the Icelandic government responsibility over foreign policy and defence. The very next month, the British asked Iceland to join the Allies. Iceland refused, citing their policy of neutrality. The British feared that Iceland's relationship with the then Nazi-occupied Denmark may mean that the Nazis could use Iceland strategically to invade them. As such, the British invaded Iceland and were met with 0 resistance. There were no deaths in the invasion.
British
In fact,
invaded
the Icelandic
during
Prime
the
Minister
Second
went
War?
on the radio and instructed the Icelandic people to treat the British as guests, although the Icelandic government said that this was a flagrant violation of Icelandic neutrality.
Yeah.
The British took on the responsibility of defending Iceland with their military. At its peak, the British stationed 25,000 troops in the country. The British occupation of Iceland lasted until 1941, when, following a brief handover of responsibility to Canada, Britain requested that the US take responsibility for defence, as they needed to deploy their troops elsewhere. The US agreed, and in its first act in the Second World War, stationed 40,000 troops on the island. This meant that, at the time, American troops actually outnumbered native adult men. While some welcomed the occupation and were happy with the increased building of infrastructure such as roads, hospital and transportation, others were frustrated with what they saw as an unnecessary military occupation. Some were so resentful over it that they accused women who had relations with their occupiers as traitors. This dislike for some was so visceral that a new word for children of these liaisons was coined. A word which roughly translates to the children of the situation. Following the Second World War, the US maintained the presence of their troops in Iceland. This relationship between the US and Iceland was codified in 1949, when Iceland joined NATO as a founding member. This was a very controversial decision in the country, so much so that Iceland was the only country that saw riots in the capital when Iceland opted to join. The riots were so intense that every window on the north face of Iceland Parliament building was smashed. Ultimately, the anti-NATO protests weren't successful, largely because politicians saw joining the organisation as essential. Iceland's foreign minister at the time explained that "my people are unarmed and have been unarmed since the days of our Viking forefathers. We neither have nor can have an army, but our country is, under certain circumstances, of vital importance for the safety of the North Atlantic area." Upon joining NATO, Iceland did not have a standing army. As part of the agreement to join, Iceland was not expected to create one, making it the only member of NATO without an army. Instead, the US established the Icelandic Defence Force, or IDF, which was mainly composed of US troops, but also included some Icelandic citizens. The group was stationed at the Naval Air Station in Keflavik and existed from 1951 until 2006. A year after the Americans left, Iceland signed a defence cooperation agreement with Norway that required Norway jet fighters and surveillance aircraft to patrol Icelandic airspace and assist in providing rescue helicopters. More recently, in 2018, they signed the Nordic Defence Cooperation Vision 2025, a multilateral security agreement between Denmark, Finland, Norway, Sweden and Iceland. Today, the closest thing that Iceland has to a standing army is the Icelandic Coast Guard, which was formed in the 20s and still exists today. The Coast Guard was responsible for defending Iceland during the infamous Cod Wars with the UK in the 1950s, which was essentially just an angry dispute over fishing rights. Iceland also has the Icelandic Crisis Response Unit, a 30-strong peacekeeping force operated by the Foreign Ministry, established in 2001. The ICRU participated in a couple of NATO and UN-led missions, but they're not that busy these days. And in 2008, they decided that, unless there was a crisis, there was no need for them actually to wear uniform or carry their guns. And in 2009, they gave up on military training. So these days, it's just, well, 30 dudes in normal clothes. Okay. Nonetheless, despite a nearly non-existent military capacity, Iceland have managed to maintain their territorial integrity. This is largely thanks to the fact they're a distant island and their relationship with the US and NATO, who have provided them with security for almost 80 years. When the country with the largest military and the largest military bloc agrees to defend you if you're attacked, perhaps you don't actually need your own military. Perhaps this whole story goes to show that international organisations are sufficient for defensive purposes. Or perhaps this only works because, relatively speaking, Iceland has a very small population. Anyway, if you like this kind of thing, we have another video where we discuss a country which doesn't have an army, or even really a country. That's Transnistria, the country which was never a country, and who weirdly actually want Putin to take them over. You can find out more in our video all about them exclusively on Nebula.
And that's just the beginning too. We have a whole load of other videos exclusively on Nebula as well. Plus the extended version of the TLDR Daily Briefing every single day. Signing up also gets you all of our videos ad-free, so no more of this nonsense. Anyway, if you do want to sign up to Nebula, the cheapest way of doing so is with the Curiosity Stream Nebula bundle deal.
Deal. There's always a deal, isn't it? Okay, so I never really thought what was happening with Iceland during the Second War. Never knew that they had no army. And it's a very peculiar situation, I think. Well, maybe not peculiar. It's just interesting that they dealing with everything without actually having an army. But it's like they pointed out in the last part of the video, saying that the fact is that they really small population and the country with the biggest army in the world, and the alliance of the biggest with the biggest country as well. Like, tells you they're gonna protect you if you're gonna get attacked. So why would they? 400,000 people, it's very little. There are cities bigger than that in, I think, Ireland as well. Like Dublin, definitely. There's more people living in Dublin than it is in our whole Iceland, so yeah. Hi, what did you think about that video? I think that was very interesting, very informative. There's another new thing that I learned today, and I see you tomorrow. Bye.